There is a number sitting inside the DNA of ethnic Russians that contradicts almost everything the word Russian is supposed to mean. It has nothing to do with borders, nothing to do with the Cyrillic alphabet, nothing to do with the double-headed eagle on a passport. It is a number buried in blood, and it says that the population most of the world imagines as one of the purest, most unbroken Slavic bloodlines on the planet is, in fact, one of the most genetically composite peoples in all of Europe. A population stitched together from Siberian hunters, Scandinavian raiders, steppe horsemen, Finnic tribes who were there long before any Slav arrived, and a shadow of the Mongol Empire that history remembers as far larger than the genome actually shows. And once you start pulling on that thread, the tidy story of the Russian people as a single ancient bloodline does not just weaken. It falls apart entirely. Start with the assumption almost everyone carries, including many Russians themselves. Say the word Russian, and the image that forms is usually singular, a Slavic people, rooted in the forests and plains between the Baltic and the Urals since time immemorial. One language, one church, one lineage stretching back into an undifferentiated past. But that image was never built from genetics. It was built from politics, from empire, from the way nations tell stories about themselves. The genome tells a very different story. Russia today is home to more than 150 distinct ethnic groups, spread across a territory that stretches from the edge of Europe to the Pacific coast of Asia, and modern genome-wide studies of self-identified ethnic Russians reveal something the national myth was never built to contain. Researchers analyzing thousands of Russian genomes have found multiple admixed ancestry clusters running from populations that are almost entirely European in origin to populations that carry substantial Asian ancestry. With unexpectedly high genetic sharing between ethnic Russians and Finnish populations, a signal strong enough that variants common in Finland turn up at notably elevated frequency inside the Russian gene pool as well. That is not the genetic signature of one bloodline. That is the signature of a population built in layers, over thousands of years, out of people who were never supposed to be the same nation at all. And this is only the surface of it, because to understand why the Russian genome looks like this, you have to abandon the idea that any national identity in this part of the world was ever built on one continuous line of descent. You have to go back to a time before Russia existed, before the Slavic languages existed, before anyone standing on that landscape had any concept of the nation their distant descendants would one day die defending. To understand how those layers formed, you have to go back long before there was a Russia, long before there was a Slavic language, long before anyone crossing the forests of Eastern Europe had any concept of the identity their descendants would one day fight and die for. You have to go back to the last ice age, to a set of ancient populations that geneticists only learned to see clearly in the last 15 years, because their remains were frozen in the ground rather than written into any chronicle. Modern Europeans, in the standard genetic model, descend from three deep ancestral sources. The first are the Western hunter-gatherers, dark-skinned, often blue-eyed foragers, who occupied the continent for thousands of years after the retreat of the glaciers. The second are the early farmers, populations that spread out of Anatolia around 9,000 years ago and brought agriculture into Europe for the first time, permanently changing how humans there lived and reproduced. The third, and by far the most transformative, are the Western steppe herders, commonly known by the name of the archaeological culture most associated with them, the Yamnaya, horse-riding pastoralists who exploded out of the grasslands north of the Black and Caspian Seas around 5,000 years ago and reshaped the genetic map of an entire continent, likely carrying the earliest Indo-European languages along with them. For most of Western and Central Europe, that three-part model, hunter-gatherer, farmer, and steppe herder, is enough to explain the genetic architecture of the population. There is also a deeper layer folded into that steppe contribution itself, one that most casual accounts of European ancestry skip over entirely. Ancient DNA research into the Yamnaya has shown that their genome was not a simple continuation of earlier steppe hunter-gatherers. It carried an additional component related to populations of the Caucasus, and, more surprisingly, a further trace of ancestry connected to Anatolia and the broader Near East, most likely absorbed through contact with early farming. Populations along the southern edge of the steppe before the Yamnaya ever began their westward expansion. That means the steppe ancestry now sitting inside the Russian genome, the ancestry conventionally described simply as steppe herder, is itself a composite built from northern hunter-gatherer populations, fused with genetic material that ultimately traces back toward the Caucasus and the Fertile Crescent. Layers within layers, each one older than the last. For Russians, the standard three-part European model is not enough. Population geneticists studying the genetic history of Russians and their northeastern European neighbors have found that this three-way framework simply fails to account for the full genetic picture because there is a fourth ingredient present in the Russian genome that barely registers anywhere further west. Alongside a Yamnaya-related steppe contribution estimated at roughly half of total ancestry, a Neolithic farmer contribution estimated around a quarter, and a hunter-gatherer contribution making up roughly an eighth. Ethnic Russians carry an additional component tied to Siberia, most closely associated with a small indigenous population living today in the Arctic called the Nganasan, contributing something in the range of a tenth of the total genetic makeup, alongside a measurable increase in shared ancestry with modern East Asians. That fourth stream did not arrive with the steppe herders, and it did not arrive with the farmers. It arrived on its own later, moving west out of Siberia, and it is the single clearest genetic fingerprint separating northeastern Europe from the rest of the continent. Ancient genome research has now traced when that Siberian signal entered the population, and the timing is startling given how recent it is compared to the deep prehistoric events that shaped the rest of the European gene pool. Analysis of ancient DNA recovered from Finland and northwestern Russia shows that this Siberian-derived ancestry began moving into the region at least 3,500 years ago, arriving well after farming had already spread across Europe and long after the steppe herders had already transformed the continent's genetic landscape. In other words, while most of Europe's ancestral architecture was essentially locked in place by the Bronze Age, the populations who would eventually become Finns, Karelians, Mordovians, Komi, and yes, ethnic Russians, were still absorbing a wave of ancestry pouring in from the Siberian interior. This is the genetic root of the Uralic-speaking world, the language family that includes Finnish, Estonian, Hungarian, and dozens of smaller languages spoken across the forests of northern Eurasia. And its fingerprints sit quietly inside the DNA of a population that, on paper, speaks a Slavic language and calls itself something else entirely. This matters because before there was ever a Russian identity in any political sense, the territory that would become Russia was not empty and it was not Slavic. It was populated by Finno-Ugric and Uralic-speaking peoples. Landscape for thousands of years adapted to its forests, rivers, and long winters. When Slavic-speaking populations expanded eastward and northward out of their homeland, likely somewhere in the region spanning modern Ukraine, Belarus, and southwestern Russia, sometime in the first millennium of the Common Era, they did not arrive into an empty land waiting to be filled. They arrived into territory already occupied by these Uralic populations, and over the following centuries, something happened that left a permanent mark on the genome. Assimilation. Uralic-speaking communities were gradually absorbed into an expanding Slavic linguistic and cultural sphere, adopting the Slavic language while contributing their own ancestry into the growing population. Genetic studies of populations from the historic core of Russian settlement, places like Pskov and Novgorod in the northwest, show exactly this signature, a blend of broader European ancestry with a substantial Siberian or Finno-Ugric genetic layer, more pronounced the further north and east you travel. Russians did not simply spread across a landscape. In a very real biological sense, they absorbed the people who were already there, and those people's DNA never left. It is worth pausing on just how large the Uralic-speaking world actually is, because it puts the scale of this hidden layer into perspective. The language family includes not just the small forest populations of northern Russia, but also Finnish and Estonian along the Baltic, and remarkably Hungarian, spoken by more than 13 million people in the middle of Central Europe, a linguistic island surrounded on all sides by Slavic and Germanic speakers. Geneticists studying this entire language family together have found that most Uralic-speaking populations, however far apart geographically, share traces of that same deep Siberian genetic signal strongest among the Nenets, Khanty, and Mansi of western Siberia, and progressively diluted the further west and south the population has migrated and intermixed. Ethnic Russians sit within the diluted end of that spectrum, carrying only a fraction of the Siberian ancestry found among indigenous Siberian populations themselves, but carrying it nonetheless, a genetic echo of a language family whose speakers were displaced, absorbed, or linguistically converted as Slavic expansion swept across the region over the last 1,500 years. Now look at the Y chromosome, the piece of the genome passed silently from father to son across the generations, because it tells its own version of this same layered story in a language of its own. Roughly half of ethnic Russian men carry the paternal lineage known as R1a, a haplogroup whose origins trace back to the Eurasian steppe and the Bronze Age Kurgan cultures associated with the earliest spread of Indo-European languages, the same broad ancestral current that produced the Yamnaya steppe herders. It is a lineage shared widely across Slavic-speaking Europe, from Poland through Ukraine and into Russia, and its dominance in the male line reflects the deep steppe contribution to the population as a whole. But alongside it sits a second major lineage, haplogroup N, particularly the branch known as N1C, which traces not to the steppe at all, but to Siberia and the Uralic-speaking world, carried into the population by exactly the same Finno-Ugric peoples, whose autosomal DNA shows up in the studies described above. And layered on top of both of these are lineages tied to entirely different origins again, including haplogroup I, associated with the hunter-gatherer populations of ancient Scandinavia and the Balkans, a lineage that would take on outsized historical importance the moment a very specific group of foreigners sailed down the rivers of Eastern Europe in the 9th century and changed the course of Russian history forever. Those foreigners were the Varangians, Norse seafarers and traders from Scandinavia who, according to the earliest chronicle of medieval Rus, were invited, or possibly forced their way in, to rule over the fractious Slavic and Finnic tribes of the region. Their leader, a prince named Rurik, is credited in that same chronicle as the founder of the dynasty that would rule Russian lands for the next 7 centuries, all the way through to the end of the 16th century. The traditional story is simple and dramatic. Vikings arrive, Vikings conquer, Vikings found the state that becomes Russia, and the name Rus itself, from which Russia ultimately takes its name, is widely believed to derive from this Norse founding group. It is one of the most quoted origin stories in all of Eastern European history. But when scientists finally got direct genetic access to actual remains of the Rurikid dynasty, rather than relying on chronicle and legend, the picture that emerged was messier than the founding myth allows. A genome-wide paleogenetic analysis of the bones of Prince Dmitry Alexandrovich, a 13th century descendant of the dynasty and son of the famous Alexander Nevsky, found that his Y chromosome lineage belonged not to a clearly Scandinavian haplogroup, but to N1A, the very same broad Uralic-linked lineage tied to the Finno-Ugric populations already discussed. Separate ancient DNA recovered from other confirmed Rurikid princes buried in Kievan-era graves paints an equally complicated picture. One prince tested from this dynasty carried autosomal ancestry that was overwhelmingly Slavic, above 90%, while another showed a mix of roughly 70% Slavic ancestry, combined with a substantial Southern European component. The male line origin of the dynasty that supposedly began with a Scandinavian warlord remains, to this day, genuinely unresolved in the scientific literature, with different Rurikid branches carrying different Y chromosome lineages entirely, some pointing toward Scandinavia, some toward the Baltic, some toward populations already resident in Eastern Europe before the Vikings ever arrived. The state-founding legend may be historically real. In its broad strokes, a small warrior elite from the north establishing political control over a much larger native population, but the genome refuses to hand over a single clean answer about who, biologically, that elite actually was. Then there's the myth that looms largest of all in popular imagination when people talk about Russian ancestry. The idea, half historical observation and half old ethnic slur, that centuries of Mongol and Tatar domination left Russians with substantial East Asian blood running through their veins. The saying, "scratch a Russian and find a Tatar," has circulated in various forms for centuries, popularized in the West as a way of casting doubt on Russia's European identity. The historical basis for the phrase is real enough for roughly 2.5 centuries. From the 13th century onward, Russian principalities existed as tributary states under the Golden Horde. The western portion of the Mongol Empire, founded by Genghis Khan's eldest son, Jochi, a period Russian chroniclers themselves referred to as the Tatar yoke. Trade, administration, taxation, and no small amount of intermarriage between Russian and Tatar elites did occur during this period, and its cultural and political legacy on the development of the Russian state is still debated by historians today. But the genetic reality is far more restrained than the folklore suggests, at least for the core ethnic Russian population. Direct DNA studies of Russian populations from the historic heartland of the country show an overwhelmingly West Eurasian genetic profile with mitochondrial DNA lineages inherited. Only through the maternal line, coming back close to 98% West Eurasian in origin, and Y chromosome paternal lineages coming back at an even higher proportion, with East Eurasian, so-called Mongoloid, lineages appearing only in very small frequencies. Even in more geographically Eastern Russian populations that migrated into Siberia in more recent centuries, researchers studying mitochondrial diversity found that East Asian-derived maternal lineages made up less than 5% of the sample, with the bulk of ancestry tracing straight back to the same West Eurasian populations found in European Russia. Separate genomic work on the actual ruling elites of the Golden Horde itself, using DNA extracted from tombs in Kazakhstan believed to belong to descendants of Jochi, found that these medieval Mongol rulers carried a distinctive Y chromosome cluster, traceable to the Mongolian plateau, but that this same genetic marker shows up at a far lower frequency in modern Eurasian populations than the scale of the historic Mongol Empire would suggest, undercutting even the popular claim that a meaningful fraction of Eurasian men today descend in the male line from Genghis Khan's own family. The Mongol period left an undeniable mark on Russian history, its institutions, its economy, its self-conception. But the genome tells us that mark was overwhelmingly political and cultural, rather than a deep biological remaking of the ethnic Russian population as a whole, where real, substantial Central Asian and steppe nomad ancestry does survive in measurable quantities today. It belongs to specific communities like the Volga and Crimean Tatar populations, and to Turkic-speaking minorities descended more directly from Golden Horde successor states, not to the broader ethnic Russian population, whose ancestry remains predominantly rooted in the older European and Siberian layers described earlier. The Golden Horde itself, meanwhile, was never a purely Mongol institution to begin with, which is part of why its genetic footprint on Russia is more diffuse than the popular imagination assumes. Historians note that the Golden Horde's population was a mixture of Turkic and Mongol peoples, with Mongols generally forming a ruling minority atop a much larger Turkic-speaking base, meaning that even the conquerors themselves were never a single homogeneous genetic block pressing down on Russian lands. Genetic studies of communities descended from Golden Horde successor populations elsewhere in Eastern Europe illustrate this well. The Lipka Tatars, a Slavic-speaking Muslim minority settled for centuries in what is now Belarus, Lithuania, and Poland, trace their ancestry to nomadic migrants who arrived from the Golden Horde and its successor, Khanats. And genetic analysis of this community shows that while they carry a real and measurable signal of steppe nomad ancestry, the majority of their overall gene pool has become thoroughly European through centuries of intermarriage with their host populations. If a community formed directly from Golden Horde migrants shows that pattern after several centuries, it helps explain why the broader ethnic Russian population, whose relationship to the Horde was primarily political and administrative rather than one of mass settlement, shows an even fainter version of the same signal. Geography adds one more twist to this story because Russian ancestry is not evenly distributed across the country's vast territory, and the regional differences are large enough to be genetically obvious. Populations from the central belt of European Russia, historic regions like Tver, Kursk, and the area around Moscow, show closer genetic affinity to neighboring Central and Eastern European populations, the kind of profile you would expect from a population sitting at the crossroads of the broader Slavic world. But travel north, toward the White Sea and the Arctic fringe, into regions like Arkhangelsk and the Mezin district, and the population shifts measurably away from that central profile, carrying a stronger signature of the Uralic, a Finno-Ugric ancestry described earlier, a legacy of the indigenous populations who occupied that harsh northern landscape long before Slavic settlement reached it. This means two people, both holding Russian passports, both calling themselves ethnic Russian without a second thought, can carry genomes shaped by genuinely different demographic histories depending on whether their ancestors settled the fertile agricultural heartland or pushed north into forest and tundra that had been Finno-Ugric territory for millennia beforehand. The national identity is singular. The underlying biology, once again, is not. The most recent and largest genomic study of the ethnic Russian population, drawing on more than 4,000 individuals sampled from major metropolitan centers in Western Russia, confirms just how layered this picture really is when examined at scale. Researchers found not one uniform genetic cluster, but several distinct, overlapping clusters ranging from populations with almost entirely European ancestry through to populations carrying substantial Asian genetic contribution, alongside that striking degree of shared ancestry with Finnish populations already mentioned. Buried within that same dataset, researchers also identified a distinct subgroup with clear Central Asian genetic origins, carrying the highest proportion of Asian ancestry segments found anywhere in the sample and showing strong genetic similarity to populations from Central Asia, a finding consistent with more recent migration history into Russia's metropolitan centers rather than any ancient steppe or Mongol legacy. What makes this study more than an academic curiosity is what its authors say about the practical consequences of ignoring this diversity. Precision medicine, the modern effort to tailor drug prescriptions, disease risk calculations, and genetic screening to a person's actual ancestry, has been built almost entirely on datasets drawn from Western European populations. Russia, despite having one of the largest and most ethnically layered populations on the planet, has been almost entirely absent from those datasets, meaning genetic risk factors and drug response variants specific to Finno-Ugric, Siberian, or Central Asian-derived segments of the Russian genome have gone largely uncatalogued by modern medical genetics. For a population whose genetic architecture straddles Europe and Asia in a way almost no other large national population does, that gap is not a minor inconvenience. It is a live blind spot in global healthcare that researchers are only now beginning to close. That blind spot matters most for the more than 150 distinct ethnicities living inside Russia's borders, who are almost never sampled at all. Populations like the Komi and the Mari in the forests of the north, the Yakut and Buryat of Siberia, or the small Nganasan community whose ancestry, ironically, sits at the very root of the Siberian genetic signal now found diluted across tens of millions of ethnic Russians. Every one of these groups carries thousands of years of adaptation to some of the harshest environments human beings have ever settled permanently. Adaptation that likely left specific, measurable fingerprints on genes related to cold tolerance, metabolism, and immune function. Fingerprints that remain almost entirely uncatalogued in the medical genetics literature, simply because global research funding and infrastructure have concentrated so heavily on Western European ancestry for the last 2 decades. Closing, that gap is not just a matter of scientific completeness. It directly affects whether a genetic test, a drug dosage calculation, or a disease risk score built primarily on European data will actually mean anything for a patient whose ancestry runs through the Siberian taiga rather than through Western Europe. So what does all of this actually add up to when you step back and look at the full shape of it? It means the word Russian was never describing a single bloodline stretching back into an undifferentiated past. It was describing the visible surface of something built in distinct, datable layers, an ancient Siberian migration fusing with the deep. Hunter-gatherer and steppe-herder ancestry that shaped the rest of Europe, a Finno-Ugric population absorbed rather than replaced as Slavic language and identity expanded across the northern forests, a small Scandinavian warrior elite whose actual genetic origin remains only partially resolved even after direct testing of royal remains, 2.5 centuries of Mongol political domination that left a real institutional legacy, but only a modest, geographically concentrated genetic one. And running beneath all of it, a regional patchwork stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific that means no two Russians, strictly speaking, are carrying quite the same story inside their cells. Every one of those layers is still there, still measurable, still shaping how researchers now think about disease risk and genetic diversity across one of the largest populations on the Eurasian landmass, and still quietly contradicting the version of history taught in classrooms on both sides of the old Cold War divide, where Russia was cast either as an unbroken Slavic civilization or as a barely disguised Asiatic horde, when the genome shows it was neither, and both, and something far more intricate than either caricature ever allowed. And the honest truth is that science has still not finished mapping it. The precise Y chromosome origin of the Rurikid dynasty is still debated among the very geneticists who have tested its remains. The exact routes and timing of the Siberian migrations that shaped the Uralic-speaking world are still being refined with every new ancient genome recovered from the permafrost. And the full genetic diversity carried by Russia's forgotten indigenous populations, the Komi, the Mari, the Udmurt, the Nganasan themselves, remains only thinly represented in the databases that modern medicine increasingly depends on. If a story like this is worth knowing, it is worth passing on, so if this changed how you think about where the Russian people actually came from, take a second to like the video, drop a comment with the part of this history that surprised you the most, and subscribe if you want more deep dives into the hidden genetic history behind the identities the world takes for granted, because this is only one thread in a much larger story still being written by scientists, one ancient genome at a time.